Hi, my name is Connie, and I'm going to talk to you about my Antarctic experience today. I spent about 2.5 years in Antarctica altogether, 3 different locations. And so this is the continent of Antarctica. It's the 5th largest continent, and it is also the driest, the coldest, and the windiest. And even though it is all ice and snow, it only gets about 8 inches of snowfall every year. And it's about 2.5 times the size of Australia. So this is the South Pole, where I spent a year. And when we arrive, you come through McMurdo Station. McMurdo is like a small mining camp. It may have a couple thousand people there during the summertime. And you come there by way of New Zealand. And then from McMurdo, we fly to the South Pole, which is about a 4-hour plane trip on a C-130 cargo naval plane. And so the 3 locations that I was first, I spent a year at the South Pole. Then I loved it so much, came back again, and I spent a summer on Beardmore Glacier here. It's a frozen river through the Trans-Antarctic Mountains. And then I came all the way here back to Palmer Station by way of ship through South America. So everybody asked me, how did you get to Antarctica? I was going to cooking school in New York, the Culinary Institute of America, and one night I was watching 2020 on a Sunday night, and Hugh Downs was outside, and he had all this gear on, and he was walking around all the longitudinal lines at the South Pole. So he looked up and he said, I just walked around the world, and now I'm going to go have lunch in the galley. And like a light bulb went off. What? They have cooks there? That's where I'm going. And just boom, I knew what I was going to do after cooking school. So most of my other fellow students, they were going to work at a hotel, a restaurant, a bakery, and not me. I was going to Antarctica. Of course, I knew nothing about it, how to get there, whatever. So, but I started telling everybody that's where I was going, and a friend of mine saw an article in U.S. News and gave it to me. So I wrote to the journalist who wrote the story on Antarctica, and he gave me the name of the company to work for. And I was in New York, they were in New Jersey. I said, great, just right down the river, let me give them a call. And I said, oh, I can come down for an interview. And they said, no, you don't understand. Don't call us, we'll call you. We only interview people once a year, and so when that time comes, we'll send you an application. Okay, fine. So I took a job just waiting for this job in Antarctica to happen in Washington, D.C. And they said they'd call me in June. June came, nobody, I didn't hear from anybody. July, and I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. I know I'm going there. So finally, the station manager for the South Pole called me, and my response was, it's about time you called. I've been waiting for this call. And so he invited me up for an interview, and that's when I found out the reality of it. I thought, oh my goodness, I want to go for the summer. Of course, it's so isolated. They must pay a lot of money. I'll go for 3 months and just have the experience. No, they paid nothing. And it wasn't 3 months, it was a year. It was at the South Pole, the coldest part of it, but didn't matter what he told me, I was going. He told me that he had a few other people to interview, and I'm like, yeah, you interview and get back to me. I just knew I had the job. So sure enough, he called me back a week later and offered me the job. So it was me and 18 men are going to spend the year at the bottom of the world. So off the adventure started. To get to Antarctica, you go by way of New Zealand. So we flew into Christchurch. That's the headquarters, and that's where you get all your gear. They give you boots and hats and gloves, you name it, anything for the cold weather. They outfit you there, and then you return it all at the end of the season when you come back. So once you get all your gear and get settled, then you fly from Christchurch to McMurdo. And the weather there can change on a dime. So you might be halfway there and have to turn all the way back. So even though you leave on a Monday, you might not get there till the following Monday because of the bad weather going back and forth. Once you finally get there, you land in McMurdo, and you basically land on an ice shelf. So in the early season, which is about October, you might land here on the ice, but by November, all that ice is melted, so the airport actually keeps slowly moving inward as the ice melts. So then we got to McMurdo, and that's kind of, like I said, a small mining camp where there's lots of activity there, and it's very close to New Zealand has a base there too, so you can walk to that one. Also next to McMurdo is Mount Erebus. Mount Erebus is an active volcano, and years ago, New Zealand used to fly tourists to Antarctica. And one year they crashed into Erebus and everyone died, and so that was the end of the tourist industry in Antarctica until now. There's tons of cruise ships that go there. So from McMurdo, then we flew to the South Pole. When we landed, I don't know if you know what a C-130 is. You're like basically on a cargo where you're strapped in and there's no real seats there, and the back comes down and you walk out. And from walking from the plane into the galley, my nose was frozen solid and burning when I got there. And I said, oh my God, I'm going to spend a year there. I was just frozen in 5 minutes. And the winter over crew that had been there for the year, they greeted us. They had just thermal underwear on and a woolen shirt, and that was it. And I said, never. And sure enough, a year later, that was me. So the elevation at the South Pole, even though it's flat and looks like a frozen sea, it's over 10,000 feet, but that changes. So the altitude is very high, and some people get altitude sickness there. But everything takes a little bit to acclimatize. But that altitude has a big effect when you're cooking. One of the things is all of my cakes had a big hole in the middle, and they would bubble off to the sides because of the altitude. It was great for bread. Bread would rise up really fast, but cakes, even brownies, which have no leavening agent, I'd have to put them in a pan this deep to make them this thin because they would bubble up and go over. And all of our food was frozen, whether it should be or not, because it was all stored within the dome. We lived in a geodesic dome, and it's about the size of a football field. But so the dome just is, it's not heated on the inside, so it's maybe 10 degrees different than the outside. And inside the dome are what they call ATCO buildings. So it's like a small trailer. So one of them would be the kitchen, another one would be where we lived, another was communication room. So all of those were in the dome. So the floor of the dome was ice or snow, and you would walk in it. And each door into these buildings was like a big freezer door. So you would open it up and you get a big puff of condensation coming in. And some of the other funny things about the food is when someone wanted ice cream, they actually had to put it in the microwave just to get their spoon in there to scoop it out. It was so hard. And we had what they call freshies, which is fresh vegetables, were very in high demand there and didn't last long. So getting them there was very expensive. And then maintaining them was kind of hard too. So when we got to the South Pole in the summertime, it's about minus 50 degrees, and there we have people coming and going all summer long, about 3 months. So we would have 80 to 100 people living there, and then they all left in March, and then there was just the 19 of us, me and 18 men, and then it takes about a month and a half for the sun to go down. Sunset slowly goes down, and then once it's gone, it's gone. It's pitch black out, and of course, you think when you never really see a black sky like that, because usually if you're outdoors, there's some light someplace. Well, there was no light anywhere for hundreds of miles away. And so also with the darkness comes the cold, being the average temperature in the summer was about -50. The average temperature in the winter is about -80. And then they have this thing called the 300 Club. When it hits -100 degrees, there's a tradition where you take off all your clothes and you run out to the pole, run around it once, and then you come back into a 200-degree sauna. Being the only woman with 18 men, I decided to decline that adventure. Also, turns out I really don't like the cold, but that's just one of the things that for fun to do there. So in the winter time, it's just 18 of us, and it's a very bizarre experience. It didn't matter if it was June, July, Monday or Wednesday. You know, the only regulation really for anybody was the meals. So I would cook lunch and dinner only. They were free for themselves to find breakfast. And then I had Sundays off. And so I would usually have leftovers or something, or a couple of the guys would decide to cook together, and they would make the Sunday meal. One of their favorite meals, though, is once a week I would make breakfast for lunch. But the eggs we had to last us for 9 months. So towards the end of the winter season, those eggs were looking pretty sad. Some of them, I'd open up the shell and they'd be green. Sometimes, you know, you could never have an over easy egg, because the minute you open the egg, the yolk would break because they were so old. But believe it or not, they didn't taste too bad. So that was a real amazing experience. It's hard to, I said, it's kind of like being on a voluntary prison. You decided to go, there's no escape. But I learned one thing, that we as humans are very adaptable to our situations. We had videos back then. We had a pool table. And also, we didn't have email then. We had, the only communication with the rest of the world was by ham radio. And that's when the stars were aligned well enough to get that. But all in all, it was a great experience. I really loved it. It was a lot of fun. And I loved Antarctica so much that I decided to go back again. So my next adventure was living on a frozen glacier called Beardmore Glacier. And Beardmore is right about here. So leaving the South Pole, I traveled for a while in New Zealand and Australia, came back to the US and decided to go to Alaska for the summer. So I went from the Antarctic to the Arctic and got a job up in the Arctic Bay for a while, much different than the South Pole. So coming back to Beardmore, we were dropped off by a helicopter. This camp was set up the year before. So the base camp was there, the helicopters dropped us off, and the doors to go in them, we opened them up, and it was solid snow. So we actually had to dig out the snow to get into the, they're called Jamesways. It's kind of like a cross between a tent and a building. So once we got in and established the electricity and turned on the generator and stuff, the helicopters took off, and we kind of opened the camp. The camp was set up for geologists to come. So we were their base camp. So we all came by helicopter, and the geologists would go out with their snowmobiles. They would be dropped off here or there around the area. And they would camp out for a while looking for fossils and things. And another thing that is very easy to spot in Antarctica are meteorites. Because of all the snow, they're just easy to see. So they get lots of meteorites from there. So that was one of the things they collected. There were fossils. I actually got a few fossils of leaves and things that were millions of years old. So that was a really nice experience. And also, it wasn't as cold at Beardmore, not like the South Pole. So I think I was there for about 5 months, and people were coming, going in the camp all the time. And then I got to do a little guest chefing. There was a station that's no longer open called Seipel Station, and that was primarily a weather station, and it was underground. So if you saw it from the air, all you would see were a few flags here or there. And they had the worst weather ever. So when you arrived, you actually climbed down a ladder, and the whole station was underground. So I got to cook there for a week while the chef went on vacation to McMurdo for a week before he wintered over. So after Beardmore, I went to, I left there and traveled through New Zealand, got on some yachts and traveled the South Pacific for about 3 or 4 months. And then from there, I went to Australia, and I lived in Sydney for a year. I got a job there and traveled all around Sydney, all around Australia. From there, I went to Bali and made my way up the coast from Singapore up to Asia and China, over through India, a little bit of Europe, back home to the US, and I think I was here about 9 months and was offered another job in Antarctica. So back I went, and this time I went through South America and took an icebreaker to Palmer Station. This is Palmer Station here. This part is kind of called the banana belt of Antarctica because it's much warmer. It's more like 50 degrees rather than -50. And it's also full of wildlife. Our neighbors was an island of like 2,000 penguins, and we had elephant seals sitting on our dock all the time. So orca whales, a lot of birds. A lot of the science that goes on there are birders studying the birds there, the skua and some of the gulls. So we never, even though I never left, the scenery changed on a daily basis because these huge icebergs would go by. Some were as big as city blocks, others a small hill, but the scenery was really beautiful. And we would also get a lot of tourists that come there from the cruise ships. So they would come in and we'd serve them cookies and coffee and give them a tour of the station, and they'd invite us out on their ship for dinner. And one day we were sitting there, one of the ships just left, and we were all sitting there having lunch, and we had this big picture window. And someone said, "Hey, that ship out there is listing." And the next thing we knew, we had a boat sinking in our kind of front yard. It was an Argentinian naval ship, and they had tourists, and they brought them there, and the captain went the wrong way on his map, hit a big rock, and within days, the ship sank. Also was the first, and I hope only, oil spill in Antarctica. So the next thing we see, these big boats coming out of the ship, and they didn't even have a decent life raft. They had the boat with the big oars, and luckily the wind was blowing in the right direction towards us, because had it been blown in the opposite direction, they would have just been blown out to sea. There were no injuries. Everybody came aboard safely, and we put out an SOS to all the other cruise ships in the area. They turned around, came back, rescued all the passengers, and then we had about 200 unexpected guests sleeping in tents and feeding them for the next week or so, because at the Palmer Station, there's no place to land a plane, so you can only come by ship. And it takes 4 or 5 days to get there. So if an emergency, you can't just have someone be there like that. They have to plan, they have to get a ship, it has to come through Chile, and so it's not an easy operation to handle, especially an oil spill. We had to get a special team from Texas, and they had to organize themselves, find a ship, get over there. So it was a huge ordeal as the oil was leaking. And luckily there wasn't a lot of oil because it wasn't carrying, it was just more or less to operate the ship. But that was another interesting experience. The highlights well, there's so many wonderful experiences that I had down there, kind of a one-of-a-kind example. I don't know if I should tell this or not, but I got to fly a C-130. They let me, sit in the cockpit and fly the plane for a while, which was kind of cool. And we got to dip over Mount Erebus, the volcano is telling you about before. They just kind of tipped the wings right over it and got a great shot looking in. And depending on your age, I don't know if some of you remember Opus. He was a cartoon character. And when I was going to Antarctica, Opus was also going to Antarctica to look for his mother. And I was a big Opus fan. So Burke Breathed is the illustrator of Opus. So one of the things that I did for fun in the wintertime was I created an Opus out of balloons and paper mache, and I knitted him a little bow tie. And there's the geographic South Pole. That's the one that's moved every year by the magnetic pole, where that is. And then there's a ceremonial pole, which is the barbershop pole, and that's where everybody gets their picture taken. So when the summer began, after I spent the year there, we took Opus out, and he was at the ceremonial pole. People took pictures of him. So I left Opus there, and I wrote to Burke Breathed and said, when I was going to Antarctica, so was Opus. Did he make it and find his mother? So he actually wrote me back a letter and said, yes, Opus made it to Antarctica, and I have a copy of that. And so for years, one of the, Scott, I think it was, one of the descendants of either Scott or Emma, I forget, they retraced the steps to the South Pole. And they had their picture taken next to Opus, my little Opus. So that was pretty cool. He was in magazines for many years. And then I got a notice from a friend who still went down there that somebody stole Opus. So Opus, but he did have a few seasons there. And this is my medal. Everyone gets an Antarctic Explorer. This is for spending a year at the South Pole. Not too many people winter over. Most people will spend the summer there, but now again the stations are much larger. They just built a new station at the South Pole, which is huge. I think hundreds of people can spend the winter over there. And with email and technology now, it's quite a bit different. And also, as I told you, I found out about Antarctica from Hugh Downs. And years later, I happened to be watching it, and it was a special where Hugh Downs got to pick some of his favorite moments of his career on 2020. And I just said, I know he's going to pick Antarctica. And sure enough, he did. That was one of the highlights of his career also. So I wrote him a letter, and I told him how because of his going to the South Pole, I ended up going to Antarctica. And he hand-typed me back a letter on a typewriter asked me if I met his son, because his son was down there also working, and that was a highlight of his career also, to go to Antarctica. So I think one of the coolest things about being there to me is thinking that I might be standing outside on a continent 2 times the size of Australia in the middle of winter at -80 degrees, and I could be the only one outside on a continent that large. That to me was like one of the coolest things of being there.